In 1950, a man suddenly appeared in the middle of Times Square in New York City. He seemed confused, looking around at the cars, signs, and people as if he'd never seen such things in his life. He was dressed in clothing from the 19th century, appearing as if a man out of time. He rushed to cross the street and was fatally struck by a taxi. In his pockets were business cards for a Robert Fentz with an address on Fifth Avenue. Banknotes more than 70 years old that looked brand new. A receipt from a horse stable, a letter postmarked 1876, and a brass slug from a saloon. It appeared as if Robert Fentz was a time traveler. Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today, we're going to look at real-life tales of time travel and parallel dimensions. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And be sure to give us a review. I'd love to hear what you think. The case of Robert Fentz landed on the desk of Captain Herbert V. Rim. Rim examined Fentz's fingerprints and found no match. He scoured the phone book and found no Robert Fentz. The address on the business card was a business, but the owner had never heard of him. He wasn't an employee. He wasn't an owner. The owner of the Fifth Avenue business was no help at all to the police. Captain Rim was stumped, but he refused to give up. Finally, after months of investigation, he found a Robert Fentz Jr. in an old address book. When he went to go interview the man, he wasn't there, but speaking to the residents of the apartment complex where Robert Fentz Jr. once lived, Rem learned that he had been a man in his 60s who passed away 5 years earlier. He was told that Fentz Jr.'s widow was still alive and living in Florida. Although it made no sense for Robert Fentz Jr., a 60-year-old man, to be the son of the 29-year-old man that appeared in Times Square, it was the only lead he had. Captain Rim contacted the widow, and she had a very unusual story. Her late husband's father, Robert Fentz Sr., disappeared in 1876, never to be seen again. An old missing persons report in the police archives confirmed this, and pictures provided by the son's widow matched the man that Captain Herbert V. Rim saw in the morgue. Now, this story has been told for decades as proof of accidental time travel. Especially in the early days of the internet, it spread like wildfire. However, many point to the origins of this story as a science fiction article written in 1951 called I'm Scared by Jack Finney. This all being said, researchers at the Berlin News Archive uncovered an article in 2007 from April of 1951, predating Jack Finney's short story by 5 months. I'm Scared appeared in September 15th edition of Colors magazine. Fact or fiction, it makes one hell of a story. A more recent story comes from Kiev, Ukraine in 2006. This is the tale of Sergei Ponomarenko. Much like Robert Fentz, he turned up out of nowhere, wandering the streets and seeming confused. His clothing was out of place, and he carried a camera that hadn't been made in decades. Police stopped and asked him for identification. Ponomarenko produced an ID from the USSR dating back to the 1950s. The photo matched, but it claimed that 25-year-old Sergei Ponomarenko was born in 1932. When the authorities pressed the matter, Ponomarenko didn't understand. As far as he knew, The year was 1958. Ponomarenko was taken to a mental health center for evaluation, where he was interviewed by Dr. Pablo Kurtrikev. He did not waver from his story and offered up his camera as proof. He said that the last thing he remembered was taking a walk with his fiancée, Valentina Kruish, when he saw a bell-shaped craft above the city. The next thing he knew, he was here. The film was developed, and it seemed to confirm his bizarre tale. The photos were of Kiev, but the buildings, the signs, the clothing, it was the 1950s. There were buildings in the photos that had long since been torn down. Ponomarenko was in the pictures, as was his fiancée, and he was dressed exactly as he was when he was found. Even more fascinating and confirming, the last photo on the camera was the UFO Ponomarenko had described. Ponomarenko spent 3 days at the hospital. On the third day, he's seen on the CCTV camera returning to his room, but then he mysteriously disappears. The police were able to track down Valentina, an elderly woman in her 70s, and she confirmed that her fiancé disappeared in 1958, only to reappear 3 days later. She said that he disappeared again in the 70s and never returned. But she received a photograph from him from the year 2050. The photo showed an older Ponomarenko standing in front of a city skyline. It's Kiev, but the buildings in the photo don't exist. Now, how valid is this story? Well, you can find numerous tellings on TikTok, YouTube, all over the internet, and all pretty much are the same story I just told. These stories point to the striking evidence of the photos, the CCTV footage, the recorded interviews with Dr. Khrushchev. The problem is, none of these are real. These all came from a Ukrainian TV show called Aliens. It was not a documentary. It was a reenactment, and one that might not have been all that well thought out. During the interview, Ponomarenko says that he was born on June 16, 1932. The ID shows he was born on March of 1932. The CCTV footage says it's Wednesday, April 23rd, 2006. April 23rd, 2006 was a Sunday. Oh, and the stamp on the ID card, although close, is not a true match to the seal of the Communist Youth League used at the time. And on a final note, that skyline from 2050, is that the Empire State Building in Kiev? These, of course, are all issues with the reproduction, not the story. This does not mean that there isn't some grain of truth that the story is based on. But until someone comes forward with the actual photos or real footage of the interview, the evidence, or lack thereof, seems fairly damning. The tale of Carol Chase McElheney is sort of the inverse of the previous two stories. But rather than another timeline, it seems she appeared in a whole different world. In 2006, Carol McElheney was traveling from her U.S. home in San Bernardino, California, to Paris, California, for a sheepdog competition. Her dog sat in the passenger seat, secured by a harness, its head hanging out the half-open window. She passed a road sign advertising Riverside, next right. Her family was from Riverside. In fact, their roots in the town dated back to the 1800s. Immediately, it brought back a flood of memories from her youth, spending time with her grandmother and the days after university where she spent living in her hometown. She reflected on how long it had been since she visited. She thought, while she was in the area, how nice it would be to visit the cemetery and see her grandparents' graves. As soon as the thought entered her mind, she could have sworn that she smelled the faint odor of cigar smoke. It was one of the few memories she had of her grandfather. She was young when he passed, but she never forgot that smell. That night, she continued on to Paris and checked into her hotel. The next day, she took her dog for the competition trials. But the draw to return home would not go away. After judging was complete, she jumped back in the car with her puppy and headed to Riverside. Her first stop was the cemetery. Except it wasn't there. She knew the intersection well. The street signs were right. But there were no graves, no gate, nothing. She was looking at an empty plot of overgrown grass. She knew it had been a while since she'd been home, but this made no sense. Did they move the cemetery? Surely she would have been notified, or at least the family would have been notified. You can't just move somebody's body without consent, right? Confused, she went to the street where her aunt and her grandmother's houses had been. They were neighbors growing up, and she remembered fondly going between them as a child, playing in the yard and running from house to house. They were bungalows built in the 1920s. Her grandmother's was a Tudor style with a eucalyptus tree out front. Just like the cemetery, however, things weren't what they should have been. The homes in front of her were newer ranch-style houses. Bushes sat under the front windows. There was no eucalyptus tree, no older homes at all. This was a whole different neighborhood. She next tried to find the house that she rented after college, and it too was missing. Carol finally decided to go to the place she knew best, University Avenue. Finally, something looked the same. Riverside City College and Central Middle School looked just like she remembered them. The rest of the street was not, however. Banks, insurance companies, restaurants, landmarks that she knew were gone. Worst yet, the streets were covered in litter and the buildings were scarred with graffiti. The people she saw made her uneasy. She feared that if she stopped and talked to someone here, she might be trapped there forever. She drove back to her hotel and was relieved to find that her key still unlocked the door. Finally, she was back in her own reality. 2 years later, her father passed away. He was buried in the plot beside her grandparents. This visit was far different than the last one. She attended the services in the cemetery and joined her cousin visiting the old haunts. Everything was back to normal, just as she remembered it in the 70s. This one, of course, is much harder to debunk. The only person with Carol that day was her sheepdog. And he isn't talking. At least not in this reality. It was a hot July day in 1954. Commuters were making their way through the airport in Tokyo, Japan. One man raised a certain degree of alarm for the Japanese officials. He was a conventional-looking Caucasian businessman, but his passport was concerning. It contained stamps from all over the world. He was well-traveled. He even had stamps from his previous trips to Tokyo. However, it showed that his country of origin was Torrid. They pulled him aside to interrogate him for more information. The man was confused. "How could you have not heard of Torrid?" he insisted. "It's been around for 1,000 years. They brought him to a detainment room and showed him a map. Immediately, the man pointed at the border of Spain and France. Most specifically, he pointed at the Principalia of Andorra, insisting that this was his homeland of Taurid. Custom officials found him in possession of money from all over Europe, but they called the company he claimed to work for, and they'd never heard of him. They called the hotel in Tokyo he had a reservation at, and they had no record of him either. Unsure of how to proceed, they moved the man into a hotel room attached to the airport. 2 guards stood outside that door. The window didn't open, but even if it did, it was a long drop onto the ground. Nevertheless, when the airport officials went to retrieve the man the next morning, he was nowhere to be found. He'd simply disappeared. This tale has existed for decades as an example of interdimensional travel. So here comes the fun part, folks. Is it real? Well, sort of. But not in the way it's told here. The man in question is John Allen Kuchar Zegrus. In October of 1959, Zegrus arrived in Japan with his Korean wife and obtained a visa using his fraudulent passport. 3 months later, in January of 1960, he was arrested for identity fraud when he attempted to cash 2 checks totaling 300,000 yen and a $140 traveler's check. Atsuki Sanza from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department Public Security Bureau spearheaded the investigation. According to the official records during the interrogation, Zegrus stated that he was born in the United States, moved to the United Kingdom through Czechoslovakia and Germany, and attended high school there. During World War II, he was a pilot for the Royal Air Force and was once captured by the Germans. After the war, he lived in Latin America. Later, he became a spy for the Americans in South Korea, served as a pilot in Thailand and Vietnam, and after that, he was assigned by the United Arab Republic. He arrived in Japan for a secret mission in which he was going to recruit Japanese military volunteers for the United Arab Republic. On August 10th, 1960, he stood trial for his crimes. During the court case, he claimed to work for both the FBI and the CIA. The Tokyo District Court sentenced him to 1 year in prison. When the translator read Zegrus' sentence, he produced pieces of broken glass from his mouth and attempted to cut his wrists. 3 guards quickly subdued him, and he was taken by ambulance to the Kyev hospital. He was later deported to Hong Kong, and his wife was sent back to South Korea. An alternate version of this story also appeared in The Province, a Canadian newspaper. On August 15th, 1960, in this version of the story, it claims that John Zegrus was a nationalized Ethiopian and an intelligence agent for Colonel Nasser, the second president of Egypt. He was issued passport from Tamanrasset, the capital of Taurid, south of the Sahara. Taurid is still not a country, but it's suggested that it may have been a misspelling of Tuareg, a people from Algeria and the surrounding area. Tamanrasset is in fact a province in Algeria. This version of the story was also used as an example by the British House of Commons as a reason why passports aren't great security measures. Regardless of which version of the story we go with, it's fairly certain that John Allen Kuchar Zegrus did not magically disappear. More than likely, he was an American-born con man, not an international spy from Egypt, the United Arab Republic, America, or anywhere else. This was a story that got out of control born from sensationalized headlines such as "The Mysterious Man from Vorin" and "The Most Convincing Real-Life Tales of Time Travel." Our last story comes from the small German village known as Frankfort-on-the-Oder. This is one of the oldest tales of parallel dimensions, as reported in the April 13th, 1851 edition of Reynolds' newspaper from Greater London, England. The story goes as follows. A man named Jophar Vorin wandered into a village. He spoke very broken German, and he claimed he was looking for his long-lost brother. He had been sailing when his ship wrecked off the coast. He didn't know exactly where it had crashed, or how he'd even found his way to Frankfurt on the Oder. Jophar said that he was from a country of Lexaria, in an area known as Sakria. Although he could speak German, broken German, his native tongues were Lexarian and Abrahamian. He was Christian, he explained, and practiced the religion of Isbatian. Lexaria was hundreds of miles from Europe, separated by vast amounts of ocean. And it wasn't called Europe where he came from, of course. The world was divided into 5 areas: Sakria, Aflar, Aslar, Oslar, and Uflar. After speaking to the burgomaster, it was determined that there was very little they could do to help him. They agreed to take him to Berlin, where they might be of more assistance. On the way, he had a seizure, and then he leapt from the carriage and disappeared into the woods. No one was able to ever find him again. It was assumed that he'd returned to the land and time from which he came. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed these stories. I'm Christopher Damian. This is History, Mystery, and the Unexplained. And thank you for listening.